It was a crisp autumn evening in the small town of Chesterton, where the glow of warm streetlights reflected on cobblestone roads. Among the bustling chatter and clinking glasses of diners enjoying their weekend, the elegant facade of Harold Grayson's Heritage Bistro stood out. The restaurant was a local icon, boasting white tablecloths, antique chandeliers, and an unspoken reputation for exclusivity. Its owner, Harold, was a middle-aged man with graying hair and a penchant for controlling every aspect of his establishment. He took pride in the restaurant's status, believing it reflected his own success. James and Marie Carter walked hand in hand through the restaurant's grand doors that evening. Marie, in a simple but elegant emerald dress, smiled warmly at her husband, who wore a charcoal blazer and exuded quiet confidence. They were here to celebrate their 10th wedding anniversary, a milestone they had worked hard to reach. The couple had chosen Heritage Bistro for its ambience, knowing little of the storm awaiting them. As they approached the hostess stand, the atmosphere subtly shifted. The hostess, a young woman named Anna, hesitated for a fraction of a second before smiling tightly. "Do you have a reservation?" she asked, her tone polite but strained. James nodded. "Yes, under Carter. 8 o'clock. Anna's eyes darted to Harold, who stood behind the bar, his sharp gaze fixed on the couple. She quickly scanned the reservation book and confirmed their table. "Right this way," she said, her voice faltering slightly as she led them to a corner booth. The Carters settled into their seats, unaware of the whispers that had begun among some of the diners. Harold watched them from a distance, his expression darkening. He leaned over to one of the servers and muttered, "Keep an eye on them. If they cause any trouble, let me know immediately." The server, a young man named Kyle, frowned but nodded. He had worked under Harold long enough to recognize his subtle codes. Trouble wasn't about behavior, it was about appearances. As James and Marie browsed the menu, their laughter and light conversation filled the air. They were blissfully unaware of the growing tension. Marie admired the restaurant's decor, complimenting James on his choice. "It's beautiful here," she said. "Perfect for our anniversary." But their evening took a turn when Kyle approached their table. His demeanor was hesitant, and his voice low. "Excuse me, sir, ma'am. I just wanted to check if you're aware of our pricing here." James raised an eyebrow, his easy smile fading. "I'm sorry." "Our pricing," Kyle repeated awkwardly, glancing around as if seeking backup. "Some customers have found it higher than expected." Marie's eyes narrowed. "Are you suggesting we can't afford to eat here?" Kyle flushed. No, that's not what I meant. It's just policy to inform guests about." "Policy?" James cut him off, his voice steady but firm. "I've been to plenty of fine dining establishments, and I've never heard of such a policy. Is this something you tell all your customers?" Before Kyle could respond, Harold appeared at their table, his presence looming. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already had an answer in mind. James looked up at him, his jaw tightening. "Not until now. Your server seems to think we need a lesson in budgeting." Harold gave Kyle a dismissive glance. "Thank you, Kyle. I'll take it from here." Turning to the Carters, he said, "I apologize if there was any misunderstanding. We just want to ensure all our patrons have a pleasant experience." Marie met his gaze, her voice calm but cutting. "A pleasant experience? By questioning whether we can afford to dine here? That's an interesting approach." Harold's expression hardened. "Perhaps this isn't the right establishment for you," he said bluntly. "We have a certain standard to maintain." James stood up, his tall frame towering over Harold. "What standard would that be, exactly?" The restaurant grew silent. Diners turned to watch the confrontation, their murmurs hushed. Harold's face reddened, but he didn't back down. "I think you know what I mean," he said, his voice low. Marie placed a hand on James's arm, her touch grounding him. "Let's go," she said softly. "This place isn't worth it." James hesitated, his anger palpable, but he nodded and helped Marie with her coat. As they walked toward the door, Harold called out after them, "You people should know better than to make a scene." Marie froze, turning slowly. "You people," she repeated, her voice echoing in the now silent restaurant. Harold smirked, his arrogance evident. "I said what I said." James clenched his fists, but Marie stopped him with a look. "Come on," she said, her tone steady. "We're better than this." They left without another word, the sound of the door closing behind them reverberating through the stunned room. Outside, the autumn air felt colder. James paced angrily, his frustration spilling over. "I can't believe the nerve of that man," he said. "I should've." "But you didn't," Marie interrupted. "And that's what matters. We don't stoop to their level." James looked at her, his anger giving way to admiration. "You're right. But we're not letting this go." Marie nodded. "No, we're not." The couple walked away, their footsteps determined. What Harold didn't know, and would soon learn, was that the Carters were far from ordinary. Their next move would turn the small town of Chesterton on its head and force the community to confront its deeply ingrained prejudices. The night that had started as a celebration of love and perseverance had taken an unexpected turn. But James and Marie were no strangers to adversity. Together, they had faced challenges far greater than one man's ignorance. And now, they were ready to fight, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel unwelcome, unworthy, or unseen. The next morning, the streets of Chesterton were bustling as usual, with locals going about their daily routines, seemingly oblivious to the events of the previous night. James and Marie Carter, however, had not slept well. The humiliation they had endured at Heritage Bistro lingered like a bitter aftertaste, but it was not the kind of memory they would allow to settle. James sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. His usually calm demeanor was replaced with a quiet intensity. Marie, on the other hand, was already busy. She had her laptop open and was typing furiously, her lips pressed into a thin line. "We can't just let this slide," James said, breaking the silence. Marie didn't look up from her screen. "We're not. I'm drafting an email to a few people I know in the media. If this place is as exclusive as it pretends to be, it won't survive a public spotlight." James leaned back in his chair, watching her work. He admired her determination, but he also knew that this was more than just about them. It was about every subtle, and not so subtle, way people like Harold Grayson tried to maintain power over others. By midday, Marie had sent out emails to local journalists and a few national contacts she'd worked with in the past. As a civil rights lawyer, her network was vast, and she knew how to wield it effectively. James, meanwhile, made phone calls to community leaders, sharing their experience and gauging interest in a broader conversation about the town's hidden biases. The response was immediate and overwhelming. By evening, the story had spread across social media. Marie had written a detailed account of what had happened, sharing it on her public profile. Within hours, the post had thousands of likes, comments, and shares. People were outraged, some expressing disbelief that such blatant discrimination could still exist in their town, while others shared their own experiences with Heritage Bistro or similar establishments. As the online backlash grew, Harold Grayson remained blissfully unaware. He had no social media presence and prided himself on keeping his business old school. It wasn't until the next morning, when he walked into the restaurant, that he realized something was amiss. The phone was ringing off the hook, and Anna, the hostess, looked pale and frazzled as she tried to keep up. "Mr. Grayson," she said, rushing over to him. "There's a situation." Harold frowned. "What kind of situation?" Anna hesitated, then handed him her phone, where Marie's post was displayed. Harold's face darkened as he read, his jaw tightening with every word. By the time he finished, his hands were shaking, not with fear, but with rage. "This is slander," he snapped. "Who does she think she is, dragging my name through the mud?" Anna didn't reply, but her silence spoke volumes. Harold stormed into his office, slamming the door behind him. He was certain this would blow over, just as similar incidents had in the past. But this time was different. Outside the restaurant, a small group of protesters had already gathered, holding signs that read, "No place for hate" and "Racism has no home here." As the day went on, their numbers grew. By lunchtime, the crowd had swelled to over 50 people, their chants echoing down the street. James and Marie watched the protest from a distance, standing on the corner of the block. They hadn't organized it, but they were heartened to see the community rallying around them. "It's a start," James said, his voice tinged with both hope and weariness. Marie nodded. "But we need more than just signs and chants. We need change." That evening, they received a call from a reporter with a major news outlet. She wanted to interview them for a feature story about their experience and the broader issue of racial discrimination in small towns. After some discussion, James and Marie agreed, knowing the interview could amplify their message even further. The following day, the reporter arrived at their home with a camera crew. She was a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Karen Morales, who had a reputation for tackling difficult topics with grace and tenacity. As the interview began, James and Marie recounted their story in detail, their emotions raw and unfiltered. "This isn't just about one bad experience," Marie said, her voice steady but passionate. "It's about a culture that allows people like Harold Grayson to feel justified in their actions. It's about a system that teaches us to endure rather than confront." James chimed in. "We're not here to destroy anyone's livelihood. We're here to hold people accountable and to ensure that this kind of behavior doesn't continue unchecked." The interview aired that evening, and the response was explosive. Viewers from across the country weighed in, many praising the Carters for their courage. Others criticized them, accusing them of overreacting or seeking attention. But the criticism only fueled their determination. Meanwhile, Harold was facing pressure from all sides. His regular customers had stopped coming, his staff was on edge, and the protesters showed no signs of leaving. Desperate to regain control, he called a local lawyer, hoping to sue the Carters for defamation. But the lawyer, after reviewing the case, delivered a harsh truth. "You don't have a leg to stand on," he said bluntly. "If anything, you should be preparing for a potential lawsuit from them." Harold was livid, but he couldn't ignore the reality. He had underestimated James and Marie, assuming they were just another couple he could intimidate. Now, he was paying the price. As the days turned into weeks, the situation continued to escalate. The protests grew larger, attracting activists from neighboring towns. Local businesses began displaying signs in their windows that read, "We stand with the Carters," and a petition to revoke Harold's business license garnered thousands of signatures. James and Marie, though encouraged by the support, remained focused on their larger goal. They organized a town hall meeting to discuss the incident and the broader issue of racism in Chesterton. To their surprise, Harold showed up, his face drawn and his demeanor subdued. As he sat in the back of the room, listening to speaker after speaker share their stories, something inside him began to shift. For the first time, he saw himself not as the victim, but as the perpetrator of a much larger problem. The meeting ended with a standing ovation for James and Marie, who had emerged as leaders in the fight for equality. Harold slipped out before anyone could notice him, his mind racing with conflicting emotions. He wasn't ready to admit it, but he knew he couldn't ignore the truth any longer. That night, as he sat alone in his empty restaurant, Harold stared at the family photographs on the wall. They were a reminder of his own journey, one that had been shaped by prejudice and privilege. For the first time, he wondered if it was possible to change, not just for himself, but for the community he had wronged. The seeds of transformation had been planted, but whether they would take root remained to be seen. For James and Marie, the fight was far from over, but they knew they had already made an impact. Their journey had become a catalyst for change, proving that even in the face of adversity, progress was possible. As the town of Chesterton simmered with tension, Harold Grayson sat alone in his office at Heritage Bistro. The once thriving restaurant had grown eerily quiet, its usual hum of activity replaced by the muffled chants of protesters outside. Harold's mind was a storm of conflicting emotions, anger, fear, and, for the first time in years, a flicker of doubt. The backlash had been relentless. Reservations had dried up, his staff was quitting in droves, and suppliers were beginning to distance themselves from his establishment. But what stung the most were the stories shared at the town hall. Harold had always prided himself on being a man of tradition, someone who upheld the values of hard work and respectability. Yet, hearing how his actions had affected others forced him to confront a question he had avoided his entire life: was he truly the man he believed himself to be? Meanwhile, James and Marie Carter found themselves thrust into an unfamiliar spotlight. Their story had become a rallying cry for change, not just in Chesterton but in similar small towns grappling with hidden prejudices. Invitations for interviews poured in from national outlets, and their faces became fixtures on television and social media. Despite the attention, they remained focused on their goal: creating meaningful dialogue and actionable change. One morning, as they sat together in their modest but cozy living room, James scrolled through his phone while Marie sipped her coffee. "Have you seen this?" James asked, holding up his screen. Marie leaned over to look. It was a video clip of a local business owner, a man they both recognized, speaking to reporters about his own experiences with discrimination. "It's spreading," Marie said, a note of hope in her voice. "People are finally talking about it." James nodded but looked thoughtful. "That's good, but talk isn't enough. We need to turn this momentum into something lasting." Marie set her cup down and leaned forward. "What are you thinking?" "A fund," James said. "Something that supports local businesses run by marginalized communities. We could call it the Chesterton Equity Initiative." Marie's eyes lit up. "I love it. We could also partner with schools to provide workshops on diversity and inclusion. Start at the root." Within days, the Chesterton Equity Initiative was born. James and Marie reached out to local leaders, educators, and activists, assembling a board of directors and securing initial funding from donations that had poured in following their story. The initiative quickly became a beacon of hope, offering grants, scholarships, and educational resources to those who had been overlooked for far too long. As the initiative gained traction, Harold found himself increasingly isolated. His once loyal customers had turned their backs on him, and even old friends were avoiding his calls. The walls of Heritage. James crossed his arms, his expression guarded. "We're listening." Harold took a deep breath. "I owe you both an apology. Not just for what happened that night, but for the way I've run my business, and my life. I've been blind to a lot of things, and I want to make it right." Marie's eyes narrowed. "Why now?" Harold looked down at his hands. "Because I've seen what happens when you ignore the truth. I've lost everything, my business, my reputation. But more than that, I've lost respect for myself. I want to rebuild, not just for me, but for this town." James and Marie exchanged a glance. There was no denying the sincerity in Harold's voice, but sincerity alone wasn't enough. "What do you have in mind?" Marie asked. Harold explained his plan to reopen Heritage Bistro as an inclusive space, with a focus on supporting local farmers, hiring a diverse staff, and hosting community events. He also offered to donate a portion of the restaurant's profits to the Chesterton Equity Initiative. "We can't undo the past," Harold said, his voice breaking slightly. But we can try to build a better future. And I want to be part of that, if you'll let me. The room was silent for a moment before James spoke. Actions speak louder than words. If you're serious about this, we'll support you. But know that we'll be watching. Harold nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. Thank you. I won't let you down. Over the next several months, Harold worked tirelessly to transform Heritage Bistro. He enlisted the help of local artists to redesign the space, incorporating elements that celebrated Chesterton's diverse history. He attended workshops on racial equity and listened to the stories of those he had wronged. When the restaurant finally reopened, it was a completely different place, not just in appearance, but in spirit. The community, though cautious at first, began to embrace the new Heritage Bistro. James and Marie were among the first guests on opening night, their presence a powerful symbol of reconciliation and hope. As they dined in the newly renovated space, James looked around and smiled. "This isn't just a restaurant anymore," he said. "It's a reminder of what can happen when people come together." Marie nodded, her eyes shining. "It's not perfect, but it's a start. And that's more than we had before." The journey was far from over, but for the first time, Chesterton felt like a place where real change was possible, a place where the past didn't have to define the future. As the months passed, the transformation of Heritage Bistro became a focal point for the town of Chesterton. Harold Grayson had stepped into uncharted territory, not only reshaping his restaurant but also himself. Yet, the road to redemption was neither smooth nor without resistance. His decision to reopen the bistro as an inclusive space drew both support and criticism, and the repercussions rippled far beyond his walls. For Harold, the most challenging moments came from within. There were days when the weight of his past mistakes felt insurmountable. Memories of the night he had thrown out James and Marie Carter haunted him, particularly the stunned, disbelieving expressions on their faces. Those images resurfaced every time he walked into the kitchen or greeted a guest. Yet, he forced himself to confront them. It was his penance and, in a strange way, his motivation to push forward. One morning, Harold stood in the dining room, now adorned with artwork from local Black and Indigenous artists. The once muted tones of the bistro had been replaced with vibrant colors and textures, each piece telling a story of resilience, culture, and community. He ran his fingers along the edge of a newly installed communal table, custom-built to encourage connections among diners. This was no longer his restaurant, it belonged to the town. Despite the changes, not everyone was ready to forgive or forget. Some patrons still whispered behind his back, questioning his motives and sincerity. Others outright refused to step foot in the bistro, labeling his efforts as performative. Harold understood their skepticism. Trust wasn't something he could demand, it had to be earned. Meanwhile, James and Marie Carter continued their work with the Chesterton Equity Initiative. The fund had gained traction, attracting national attention and substantial donations. Workshops were now being held in schools and community centers, teaching the history of racial inequities and fostering open dialogue. Local businesses began partnering with the initiative, committing to hiring practices that reflected the town's diversity. James had taken on the role of a mentor, guiding young entrepreneurs from marginalized backgrounds. He found joy in sharing his knowledge and seeing others succeed where systemic barriers had previously stood in their way. Marie, on the other hand, focused on storytelling. She curated a traveling exhibit called Voices of Chesterton, showcasing personal narratives from residents who had faced discrimination. The exhibit became a powerful tool for empathy, drawing crowds wherever it went. One evening, James and Marie were preparing for an event at the community center when they received an unexpected visitor, Harold. He stood at the door, clutching a folder and looking uncharacteristically hesitant. "Harold," Marie greeted, her voice a mix of surprise and curiosity. "What brings you here?" "I wanted to show you something," Harold replied, stepping inside. He handed the folder to James, who opened it to reveal detailed plans for a scholarship program. Harold explained that he had been inspired by the work of the initiative and wanted to contribute in a meaningful way. The scholarship would be funded by a percentage of the bistro's profits and aimed at supporting students pursuing careers in hospitality and culinary arts, with a focus on underrepresented communities. "I know it's just a small step," Harold said, his voice tinged with vulnerability. "But I want to give back. To help build something better." James and Marie exchanged a look. They had seen Harold's efforts to change, but this gesture felt different. It wasn't about saving his business or reputation, it was about creating opportunities for others. "This is a good idea, Harold," James said finally. "But if you're serious about this, you'll need more than money. You'll need to mentor these students, share your knowledge, and be there for them." Harold nodded. "I'm ready. Whatever it takes." The scholarship program launched to great fanfare, with Harold personally interviewing the first round of applicants. He was struck by their stories, young people brimming with talent and ambition, many of whom had faced obstacles he could scarcely imagine. One applicant, a shy high school senior named Lila, shared her dream of opening a bakery that celebrated her grandmother's recipes from Ghana. Her passion and determination reminded Harold of why he had fallen in love with the culinary world in the first place. Lila became the first recipient of the Heritage Scholarship, and Harold took her under his wing. He taught her the ins and outs of running a kitchen, from perfecting recipes to managing inventory. In return, Lila taught Harold about the flavors and traditions of her culture, sparking a creative renaissance in the bistro's menu. The dishes they created together became instant hits, drawing diners from neighboring towns and even a few food critics. As the bistro flourished, so did Lila. She began hosting pop-up events showcasing her baked goods, and with Harold's encouragement, she entered a national competition for young chefs. When she won first place, the entire town of Chesterton celebrated, seeing her victory as a testament to what could be achieved when barriers were broken down. Yet, amidst the progress, there were moments of tension. One evening, as Harold and Lila worked late in the kitchen, they overheard a heated argument in the dining room. A group of diners had taken issue with a black server, accusing him of being too slow and demanding to speak to the manager. Harold approached the table, his heart pounding. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. The leader of the group, a middle-aged man with an air of entitlement, sneered. "Yeah, your server doesn't seem to understand how to do his job." Harold glanced at the young server, who looked visibly shaken. "I assure you, he's doing his job just fine. If there's an issue, it's not with him." The man's face turned red. "Are you seriously taking his side? This is why your kind of place never lasts." For a moment, the old Harold might have been tempted to appease the customer, to smooth things over and avoid conflict. But the new Harold stood his ground. "This restaurant is built on respect. If you can't show that to my staff, you're not welcome here." The group left in a huff, muttering insults under their breath. Harold turned to the server, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You handled that well. Don't let them get to you." Word of the incident spread quickly, and while some criticized Harold's stance, many more applauded his refusal to tolerate discrimination. It became a defining moment for the new Heritage Bistro, solidifying its reputation as a place where everyone was valued. As the weeks turned into months, Harold found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. The man who had once clung to outdated beliefs and resisted change had become an advocate for progress. His transformation wasn't perfect or complete, there were still moments of doubt and missteps, but it was genuine. One evening, as the bistro hummed with activity, Harold stepped outside for a moment of quiet. The air was cool, and the faint sounds of laughter and clinking glasses drifted through the open door. He looked up at the stars, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Inside, James and Marie sat at their usual table, watching as Lila brought out a tray of her signature pastries. "You know," James said, taking Marie's hand, "it's amazing how much can change when people are willing to listen." Marie smiled. "And when they're willing to act." The bistro, once a symbol of exclusion, had become a place of connection and possibility. It wasn't just a restaurant anymore, it was a testament to the power of redemption and the resilience of a community determined to move forward together. And as Harold looked through the window, seeing the joy and camaraderie inside, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. The momentum of change in Chesterton, ignited by the events at the Heritage Bistro, began to ripple far beyond the restaurant. The community that had once been a patchwork of unspoken tensions and division was now coming together in ways no one could have anticipated. Yet, as the town transformed, the journey for Harold, James, Marie, and others remained deeply personal and complex. Harold's dedication to the Heritage Scholarship Program was unwavering. Each year, new recipients were selected, each bringing their unique story and perspective to the program. Lila, the first scholar, had gone on to open her bakery, which quickly became a town favorite. It was more than a business, it was a space where people gathered, shared stories, and celebrated diversity. The bakery's success inspired other local entrepreneurs to dream big, often with Harold acting as a quiet but steadfast mentor. But the changes weren't universally embraced. There remained a vocal minority in Chesterton resistant to the shift toward inclusivity. Harold received anonymous letters criticizing his decisions and accusing him of abandoning his roots. Some former patrons of the bistro had taken their business elsewhere, refusing to support what they saw as unnecessary pandering. Each piece of criticism cut deeply, but Harold used it as fuel to stay the course. One particular incident served as a stark reminder of the challenges ahead. Late one evening, Harold was locking up the bistro when he noticed something unusual on the front window, a crude, hateful message scrawled in red spray paint. His heart sank as he read the words, each one a painful reminder of the bigotry he had once been complicit in and now sought to dismantle. By morning, the news of the vandalism had spread. Harold arrived at the restaurant to find a small crowd gathered outside. Among them were James and Marie, along with Lila and several of her friends. They held cleaning supplies and a large banner that read, "Hate has no place here." Without a word, they got to work. Harold joined them, scrubbing at the graffiti until his hands ached. Passers-by stopped to help, turning the act of cleaning into a powerful display of unity. By the time the window was restored, the bistro's exterior was not just clean but transformed. Bright flowers had been planted in pots along the sidewalk, and the banner was displayed proudly above the entrance. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Harold gathered everyone for a spontaneous meeting, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "What happened here last night was ugly," he said, looking around the room. "But what you all did today, that's the real story. That's what Chesterton is becoming." James stepped forward, placing a hand on Harold's shoulder. "And that's because of you, Harold. You could have walked away after what happened, but you stayed. You chose to be better. And because of that, this town is better." The momentum of change in Chesterton, ignited by the events at the Heritage Bistro, began to ripple far beyond the restaurant. The community that had once been a patchwork of unspoken tensions and division was now coming together in ways no one could have anticipated. Yet, as the town transformed, the journey for Harold, James, Marie, and others remained deeply personal and complex. Harold's dedication to the Heritage Scholarship Program was unwavering. Each year, new recipients were selected, each bringing their unique story and perspective to the program. Lila, the first scholar, had gone on to open her bakery, which quickly became a town favorite. It was more than a business, it was a space where people gathered, shared stories, and celebrated diversity. The bakery's success inspired other local entrepreneurs to dream big, often with Harold acting as a quiet but steadfast mentor. But the changes weren't universally embraced. There remained a vocal minority in Chesterton resistant to the shift toward inclusivity. Harold received anonymous letters criticizing his decisions and accusing him of abandoning his roots. Some former patrons of the bistro had taken their business elsewhere, refusing to support what they saw as unnecessary pandering. Each piece of criticism cut deeply, but Harold used it as fuel to stay the course. One particular incident served as a stark reminder of the challenges ahead. Late one evening, Harold was locking up the bistro when he noticed something unusual on the front window, a crude, hateful message scrawled in red spray paint. His heart sank as he read the words, each one a painful reminder of the bigotry he had once been complicit in and now sought to dismantle. By morning, the news of the vandalism had spread. Harold arrived at the restaurant to find a small crowd gathered outside. Among them were James and Marie, along with Lila and several of her friends. They held cleaning supplies and a large banner that read, "Hate has no place here." Without a word, they got to work. Harold joined them, scrubbing at the graffiti until his hands ached. Passers-by stopped to help, turning the act of cleaning into a powerful display of unity. By the time the window was restored, the bistro's exterior was not just clean but transformed. Bright flowers had been planted in pots along the sidewalk, and the banner was displayed proudly above the entrance. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Harold gathered everyone for a spontaneous meeting, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "What happened here last night was ugly," he said, looking around the room. "But what you all did today, that's the real story. That's what Chesterton is becoming." James stepped forward, placing a hand on Harold's shoulder. "And that's because of you, Harold. You could have walked away after WH. It happened, but you stayed. You chose to be better. And because of that, this town is better." Harold's throat tightened, and he could only nod in response. For the first time in years, he felt like he truly belonged, not just in the town, but in the community he was helping to build. Meanwhile, the Chesterton Equity Initiative continued to gain traction, reaching neighboring towns and even attracting the attention of state officials. James and Marie were invited to speak at conferences, sharing their model for community-driven change. Their work inspired similar initiatives across the region, creating a network of advocates dedicated to equity and inclusion. One such advocate was a young woman named Sophia, who had attended one of the Carter's workshops. Moved by their story and the transformation of Chesterton, she decided to start a project in her own town, addressing disparities in housing and education. She reached out to James and Marie for guidance, and they gladly offered their support. Over time, Sophia's project grew into a movement, proving that the seeds of change planted in Chesterton could flourish far and wide. Back in town, the bistro continued to thrive, not just as a restaurant but as a hub for community events. It hosted open mic nights, cultural celebrations, and cooking classes, each event drawing a diverse crowd. Harold took pride in seeing the space filled with laughter, conversation, and collaboration. He often thought about how far he had come, from a man clinging to outdated traditions to someone who embraced change and celebrated difference. One particularly memorable evening at the bistro was a storytelling night organized by Marie. Residents were invited to share personal stories that highlighted resilience, growth, and community. Harold was hesitant at first, unsure if he had a story worth telling. But as he listened to others share their experiences, he felt a pull to step forward. When his turn came, Harold stood before the crowd, his hands trembling slightly. He took a deep breath and began. "I used to think that change was something that happened to other people, not me. I thought I had everything figured out, that the world needed to fit into my narrow view. But I was wrong. And it took something ugly, something I'm not proud of, to make me see that." He went on to recount the events that had unfolded in the bistro that fateful night and the journey of transformation that followed. He spoke about his mistakes, his struggles to reconcile with his past, and the people who had helped him along the way. By the time he finished, the room was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Then, one by one, people began to clap. The applause grew louder until it filled the room, a powerful affirmation of Harold's journey and the community's shared progress. Harold felt a surge of gratitude, not just for the applause but for the opportunity to make amends and contribute to something bigger than himself. As the night wound down, Harold sat with James and Marie, reflecting on the path they had traveled together. "Do you think we've done enough?" he asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Marie smiled. "The work is never done, Harold. But what matters is that we keep trying. That we keep showing up." James nodded in agreement. "It's not about erasing the past. It's about learning from it and building a better future." Harold leaned back in his chair, letting their words sink in. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace, not because everything was perfect, but because he was finally on the right path. As he looked around the bistro, filled with people from all walks of life, he realized that the real transformation wasn't just in the restaurant or the town, it was in himself. And while the road ahead was still uncertain, one thing was clear: Harold, like Chesterton, had become a testament to the power of change, the resilience of community, and the enduring belief that it's never too late to make things right. The transformation of Chesterton and its people had been profound, but as with any journey, the path was far from linear. Part 6 of this story dives deeper into the complexities of healing, the lingering tensions, and the unexpected challenges that arose even as the community continued to evolve. It was a chapter marked by moments of doubt, resilience, and ultimately, an enduring hope that echoed far beyond the town's borders. Months after Harold's heartfelt storytelling night at the bistro, Chesterton found itself thrust into the national spotlight. A documentary filmmaker, drawn by the remarkable changes in the town, reached out to James and Marie to feature their work in a series about grassroots movements redefining America. Though hesitant at first, the couple realized the potential of such exposure to inspire others. They agreed, with one condition: the story must include every voice, from the community leaders to the quiet but essential contributors like Harold and Lila. The documentary team arrived with cameras, notepads, and an insatiable curiosity. They interviewed dozens of residents, capturing raw, heartfelt stories of struggle and redemption. Harold found himself in front of the camera more than he expected, recounting his journey with a vulnerability that surprised even him. The process was cathartic, forcing him to confront parts of his past he had tried to bury, and to articulate the growth he had experienced in ways he had never considered before. As the filming progressed, it became clear that not everyone shared the same view of the town's transformation. A few business owners, still clinging to the old ways, openly criticized the new direction. They claimed that Chesterton was losing its identity, that the push for inclusion was nothing more than a trend that would fade. Their voices, though in the minority, were loud and persistent. It created a tension that threatened to undermine the progress the community had made. One of the most vocal critics was George Hansen, a lifelong resident who owned a hardware store that had been in his family for generations. George saw the changes in Chesterton as a threat to his legacy. He accused Harold and others of pandering to outsiders and eroding the values he believed defined the town. His rhetoric found an audience among a small but passionate group of townsfolk who shared his fears of losing what they saw as the real Chesterton. The tension came to a head during a town hall meeting, organized as part of the documentary project. It was meant to be a celebration of Chesterton's progress, but it quickly became a battleground for competing visions of the town's future. George stood up and delivered a fiery speech, accusing the Equity Initiative of being divisive and claiming that the Heritage Bistro had become a symbol of everything wrong with the town. Harold listened in silence, his hands gripping the edge of his chair. He felt the weight of George's words, not just as criticism of the bistro but as a rejection of the person he had worked so hard to become. When George finished, the room was tense, the air heavy with unspoken emotions. Harold knew he had to respond, but he also knew that anger would only deepen the divide. He stood slowly, his voice steady but firm. George, I hear your frustration. And I understand that change is hard, it's been hard for me too. But this isn't about erasing what Chesterton was. It's about making room for what it can be. The Heritage Bistro isn't just a restaurant anymore. It's a place where people come together, where we celebrate what makes us different and what brings us together. That's not a threat to our town, that's its strength. The room was silent for a moment before James stood as well. We're not here to destroy traditions, George. We're here to create new ones, ones that include everyone. Isn't that what legacy is really about? Leaving something better for the next generation? George didn't respond, but his expression softened slightly. The meeting ended without resolution, but it was clear that the conversation was far from over. In the weeks that followed, the tension began to ease, thanks in part to the documentary team's efforts to highlight stories of compromise and collaboration. One of the most poignant moments in the film came from an interview with Lila, who spoke about the challenges of opening her bakery and the support she received from unexpected places, including George's wife, Martha, who had become a regular customer. It was a small but powerful reminder that change often happens in quiet, personal moments rather than grand gestures. When the documentary premiered, it was met with widespread acclaim. It painted an honest picture of Chesterton, showcasing both its struggles and its triumphs. The town became a symbol of what was possible when people chose courage over fear, empathy over prejudice, and action over complacency. But the impact of the documentary was felt far beyond Chesterton. Emails and letters poured in from all over the country, from people inspired by the story and eager to start similar initiatives in their own communities. James and Marie found themselves traveling frequently, sharing their experiences and offering guidance to others. Harold, though content to stay in Chesterton, became a sought-after speaker for business owners looking to create more inclusive spaces. One of the most touching moments came when Harold received a handwritten letter from a young man named Caleb, who lived in a small town several states away. Caleb wrote about how he had been struggling with his own biases and how Harold's story had inspired him to confront them. "You showed me that it's never too late to change," the letter read. "Thank you for being brave enough to show the rest of us how." The letter became a source of strength for Harold, a reminder that the work he was doing mattered. He framed it and hung it in the bistro, where it served as a daily affirmation of the power of redemption and the ripple effects of a single decision to do better. As Chesterton continued to evolve, the people who had been at the heart of its transformation found new ways to contribute. Lila expanded her bakery to include a program for aspiring chefs from the man he had been and the man he had become, about the mistakes he had made and the lessons he had learned. He knew there was still work to be done, but for the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. James joined him, a quiet smile on his face. "We've Coma-represented backgrounds." James and Marie launched a nonprofit dedicated to community development, with chapters springing up in towns and cities across the country. Harold, meanwhile, focused on mentoring the next generation of leaders, quietly guiding them as they navigated their own journeys of growth and change. By the time the anniversary of that fateful night at the bistro arrived, the town was nearly unrecognizable, not because it had lost its identity, but because it had found a better one. A celebration was held at the bistro, bringing together people from all walks of life to honor the progress they had made and the challenges they had overcome. As the evening wound down, Harold stood outside, looking up at the stars. He thought about the man he had been and the man he had become, about the mistakes he had made and the lessons he had learned. He knew there was still work to be done, but for the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. James joined him, a quiet smile on his face. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Harold nodded. "We have. And we've still got a long way to go." James clapped him on the shoulder. "Good thing we're in this together." As they stood there, side by side, the sounds of laughter and music drifting from the bistro, it was clear that Chesterton's story was far from over. It was a story of transformation, resilience, and the enduring power of community, a story that would continue to inspire and evolve for years to come.